When All in the Family went on the air after we had 8 in the can, and it started in the next few weeks to climb to #1, we were all feeling our oats, and I went.
For millions of Americans, All in the Family was comfort television. It played in living rooms during dinner, echoed through apartment walls, and became part of the cultural background noise of the 1970s. The arguments were loud, the jokes were sharp, and the characters felt familiar enough to argue with relatives. But behind the laughter, behind the applause breaks and punchlines, the experience of making All in the Family was far more intense, more personal, and far more emotionally complicated than audiences ever realized. Decades later, when the cameras were long gone and the political arguments had shifted to new generations, one voice began to stand out in quiet reflection. When the laughter stopped meaning safety. Sally Struthers, who played Gloria Stivic, wasn't interested in nostalgia or mythology. In interviews, retrospectives, and personal conversations, she spoke about the reality of sharing a set with Rob Reiner, the man who played her on-screen husband, and the pressures that came with being at the center of one of the most controversial shows in television history. What she revealed wasn't scandal, it was something deeper. A story about emotional strain, creative intensity, ideological conflict, and the cost of carrying social change on your shoulders while millions of people watched. This is not the story of betrayal or accusation. This is the story of truth, memory, and what happens when comedy becomes history before the people inside it are ready. Sally Struthers, before All in the Family, talent without armor. Before America knew her as Gloria Bunker Stivic, Sally Struthers was a young actress trying to find stability in an industry that offered very little of it. Born in Portland, Oregon in 1947, she grew up far from Hollywood power circles. Her parents divorced when she was young, and by her own account, she learned early how unpredictable adulthood could be. Sally studied drama at the Pasadena Playhouse, an institution known for training actors in emotional precision and discipline. She had talent, range, and an expressive face that could move from warmth to frustration in seconds. But like many actresses of her generation, she entered television at a time when women were often written as accessories rather than engines of stories. Her early television roles were brief and unremarkable. Guest spots, small parts, characters designed to support male leads. Nothing suggested she was about to become one of the most recognizable faces in American television, or that she would soon be carrying some of the most emotionally charged scenes of the decade. When Sally auditioned for All in the Family, she wasn't auditioning for a sitcom in the traditional sense. Norman Lear's script didn't feel safe. It didn't feel comfortable. It confronted sexism, racism, generational conflict, and political division head-on. Sally later said she understood immediately that this show would either change her life or destroy her career. What she couldn't have known was how deeply it would reshape her emotional world. Rob Reiner arrives as Mike Stivic, and everything gets louder. Rob Reiner entered All in the Family with a weight that few young actors carried. He was the son of Carl Reiner, already a television legend. From the moment Rob stepped into the industry, comparisons were unavoidable. But All in the Family didn't allow room for subtlety or gradual growth. Mike Stivic was loud, ideological, confrontational, and written to clash with Archie Bunker at full volume. Sally Struthers has repeatedly described Rob as intensely focused on set. Not arrogant, not cruel, but driven by a sense of responsibility to the character. Mike wasn't just a role to Rob, he was a statement. A representation of a generation that felt unheard and misrepresented. The problem was that audiences didn't separate Rob Reiner from Mike Stivic. Sally recalled that fans often reacted to Rob with genuine hostility in public spaces. People shouted "meathead" at him, argued with him, blamed him for opinions that belonged to the character, not the actor. The emotional toll was real, and it didn't switch off when the cameras stopped rolling. On set, Rob brought that intensity with him. According to Sally, scenes weren't played for laughs first, they were played for truth. Political arguments between Mike and Archie often mirrored real disagreements between cast members. Carol O'Connor and Rob Reiner did not share political beliefs, and that friction fueled the show's realism. Sally was caught in the middle. As Gloria, she wasn't just a wife reacting to her husband or a daughter reacting to her father. She was the emotional bridge between two ideologies. Sally has said that playing Gloria required constant emotional calibration. Too submissive, and the character became irrelevant. Too aggressive, and she risked being dismissed by audiences not ready to hear a woman challenge both men at once. Behind the scenes, Sally observed Rob's discipline closely. She later said she never saw him lose control emotionally on set, even when scenes became heated. But that control came at a cost. Rob carried the responsibility of representing a movement while still functioning as an actor inside a sitcom structure. That pressure shaped everything that followed. Living inside the argument, what All in the Family cost its stars. By the time All in the Family reached its stride, it was no longer just a television show. It was a weekly national argument staged in front of a studio audience. And Sally Struthers found herself living inside that argument every single day. The scripts did not offer escape or relief because the conflicts didn't reset at the end of each episode. They carried forward, mirroring the real divisions tearing through American society during the Vietnam War era, the women's liberation movement, and the growing generational fracture between parents and their children. For Sally, this meant that Gloria was never allowed to exist as a simple sitcom wife or daughter. She had to be emotionally present, politically aware, and constantly reactive to two men who represented opposite ends of the American identity crisis. Sally has spoken openly about how emotionally exhausting this became over time because Gloria was not written to dominate conversations, but to absorb them, to feel the impact of Mike's righteous anger and Archie's blunt hostility simultaneously while still maintaining warmth, humor, and humanity. In many scenes, Gloria was the only character expressing visible emotional consequence, and Sally understood that if she didn't ground those moments in sincerity, the show would tip into cruelty instead of commentary. This placed an enormous burden on her performance because she wasn't just playing lines, she was processing ideology in real time while millions of viewers judged her reactions. Rob Reiner, meanwhile, approached Mike Stivic with an intensity that Sally later described as unwavering and deliberate, not because he wanted attention, but because he felt morally obligated to honor what the character represented. Mike was written as confrontational, idealistic, and often impatient, and Rob leaned into that energy fully, understanding that the audience needed to feel how disruptive youth culture felt to the older generation. However, that commitment meant Rob rarely disengaged from the character, even between takes, because the show moved quickly, and the material required constant emotional readiness. Sally observed that Rob carried the weight of public reaction more visibly than anyone else on set because viewers didn't just disagree with Mike Stivic. They blamed Rob Reiner personally. He was heckled in public, shouted at in restaurants, and confronted by strangers who believed he embodied everything they disliked about social change. And this constant external pressure filtered back into the workplace. According to Sally, Rob never lashed out, never raised his voice inappropriately, and never allowed frustration to disrupt professionalism, but the tension was always present, simmering beneath the surface. The blurred boundary. What made the experience more complicated was that All in the Family blurred the boundary between performance and reality in a way television rarely had before. Arguments that began in the script continued in interviews, newspaper editorials, and viewer mail, and Sally recalled that the show received thousands of handwritten letters weekly, some praising Gloria for standing her ground, and others condemning her for betraying traditional values. She later said that she often felt like she was being judged not as an actress, but as a woman whose personal beliefs were assumed to match her character's choices. This pressure intensified as the show grew more successful, because success did not bring safety, it brought scrutiny. Every gesture, every facial expression, every line reading became subject to interpretation, and Sally knew that if she played Gloria too softly, she risked reinforcing stereotypes, while if she played her too firmly, she risked alienating viewers who were not ready to accept a woman asserting autonomy in both marriage and politics. That tightrope walk became her defining professional challenge, and it required emotional stamina that no acting class could fully prepare her for. Rob Reiner understood that burden, and Sally has consistently described their working relationship as respectful, focused, and rooted in mutual trust rather than friendship or comfort. They were not playful on set, and they were not careless with one another's emotional space because the material demanded seriousness. Rob treated scenes like negotiations rather than performances, calibrating tone and timing carefully. And Sally matched that discipline because anything less would weaken the show's impact. At the same time, the presence of Carol O'Connor intensified everything. Carol was deeply invested in Archie Bunker as a character, even though he did not personally share Archie's views. And his commitment to portraying bigotry honestly created moments of genuine emotional friction during rehearsals. Sally has said that there were days when the atmosphere felt heavy before the cameras even rolled, because everyone understood that the episode would provoke strong reactions once it aired. The cast didn't just act, they braced themselves. Despite this, Sally has emphasized that Rob Reiner never treated her as secondary or disposable. Even though Mike's arguments often dominated scenes, he listened, adjusted pacing, and understood that Gloria's reactions were essential to grounding the chaos. She later reflected that Rob's greatest strength as an actor during those years was his awareness of rhythm, knowing when to press forward and when to pull back, so that the emotional balance of a scene remained intact. As seasons passed, however, the cost of living inside this intensity became harder to ignore. Sally began to feel that the character of Gloria was evolving faster than the industry itself was willing to support, because while the show allowed her to voice feminist ideas on screen, opportunities for women off-screen remained limited. She was still being offered roles defined by domesticity or dependence, even as Gloria became a symbol of changing expectations for women across America. Rob, too, began to feel constrained, not creatively but existentially, because Mike Stivic had become a public identity he could not escape. Sally noticed that Rob spoke less about acting as the years passed and more about storytelling, structure, direction, and authorship, signaling a shift that would soon take him away from the camera entirely. She later said that watching Rob evolve during those years felt like witnessing someone outgrow a space that could no longer contain them. The irony was that All in the Family was at the height of its influence precisely when its stars began feeling the greatest strain, because the show demanded emotional truth without offering emotional protection. It asked its performers to carry social conflict into their own lives, and for Sally Struthers, that meant learning how to compartmentalize pain, criticism, and exhaustion, while still showing up with warmth and sincerity week after week. Looking back, Sally did not describe those years as traumatic, but she did describe them as consuming, explaining that All in the Family didn't just reflect America's divisions, it absorbed them. And inside that absorption, Rob Reiner was not an antagonist or a villain, but a fellow participant navigating the same storm from a different position, one shaped by visibility, expectation, and the relentless demand to represent more than oneself. By the time the show approached its later seasons, Sally sensed that something was shifting, not just in Rob, but in the entire creative environment, because the conversations that once felt urgent were beginning to feel repetitive, and the emotional toll of carrying history every week was becoming unsustainable. What followed would change the trajectory of both their lives, as Rob made a decision that would redefine his career, and Sally confronted the quiet aftermath of being forever linked to a role that spoke louder than she ever intended. When Rob Reiner walked away, and the silence it left behind. By the time Rob Reiner began considering his exit from All in the Family, the decision had less to do with dissatisfaction and more to do with inevitability. Because the role of Mike Stivic had grown so large, it threatened to consume every other version of himself. The character had become a cultural symbol rather than a performance, and that transformation carried a weight Rob could no longer ignore. He wasn't simply playing a man with strong opinions, he was embodying a generation's anger, idealism, and moral urgency, and audiences responded accordingly, often without separating fiction from reality. Sally Struthers noticed the change before Rob ever announced his plans publicly, because the rhythm of his presence on set began to shift. He remained professional, focused, and generous in scenes, but his attention increasingly drifted toward structure rather than spotlight, toward how moments were shaped instead of how they landed. He asked questions about pacing, about audience perception, about why certain scenes were placed where they were. And Sally later reflected that it felt less like an actor preparing lines and more like a storyteller trying to understand the machinery behind the curtain. The strain Rob carried was amplified by the way Mike Stivic followed him everywhere. Fans didn't just recognize him, they confronted him. They argued with him, insulted him, praised him, and sometimes blamed him personally for the views his character expressed. Sally recalled that Rob took this with remarkable restraint, never escalating conflict and never dismissing people outright. But the emotional toll was undeniable. Being treated as a political symbol instead of a person narrowed his public identity until there was little room left to breathe. When Rob made the decision to leave All in the Family in the late 1970s, it wasn't abrupt, but it was final. He had already begun experimenting with directing, writing, and conceptual storytelling, and he understood that staying on the show would delay a transition he felt compelled to make. His final appearances as Mike Stivic were written carefully, allowing the character to move forward without spectacle, but the absence that followed was immediate and palpable. For Sally Struthers, Rob's departure was not just the loss of a scene partner, it was the removal of a counterweight that had shaped Gloria's entire emotional world. Mike's presence had given Gloria friction, purpose, and urgency, and without him, the character's center shifted. Sally has spoken about how difficult that transition was, because the show continued, but the ideological engine that once powered Gloria's voice had changed, leaving her to recalibrate not only her performance, but her understanding of who Gloria was meant to be. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere changed as well. All in the Family remained popular, but the intensity softened, and the debates that once felt raw and combustible became more reflective, sometimes even subdued. Sally felt that the show was entering a new phase, one that required adjustment rather than confrontation. And while that evolution was natural, it carried a quiet sense of loss for what had once been electric. Rob Reiner, meanwhile, stepped into a period of creative uncertainty that he embraced rather than feared. Leaving a role that defined a decade of television was risky, especially when that role had earned him awards, recognition, and cultural permanence. But Rob understood that staying would eventually limit him more than leaving ever could. Sally later said that watching him make that leap felt both courageous and lonely, because there were few examples at the time of actors successfully reinventing themselves behind the camera. What made Rob's departure especially significant was the absence of bitterness. He did not criticize the show, the cast, or the creative leadership. He spoke respectfully about Norman Lear, Carol O'Connor, and Sally herself, acknowledging that All in the Family had given him a platform and a voice at a critical moment in American history. That restraint stood in contrast to the assumptions many viewers made, expecting conflict or resentment where there was none. For Sally, the aftermath of Rob's exit forced a confrontation with a reality she had quietly feared. Gloria Cunningham had become inseparable from the cultural moment that Mike Stivic helped ignite, and without him, the character's symbolic power diminished in ways that were difficult to reverse. Sally continued performing with dedication, but she felt the shift in audience engagement, the subtle recalibration of expectations, and the growing awareness that Gloria's most influential chapters had already been written. At the same time, Sally recognized that Rob's decision was not an abandonment, but an evolution. He was not running away from All in the Family. He was running toward something else, something undefined, but deeply compelling. She later reflected that Rob's courage lay not in rejecting his past, but in refusing to be trapped by it, a distinction that would become clearer as his directing career began to unfold. The silence Rob left behind on the set was not dramatic or disruptive, but it lingered because All in the Family had been built on balance, on opposing forces colliding with purpose. Without Mike Stivic, that balance shifted permanently, and while the show adapted, it never quite recreated the same spark that had once made it impossible to ignore. For Sally Struthers, Rob's absence marked the beginning of a quieter reckoning, one where she had to reconcile her pride in the work they had done together with the reality that television rarely allows its performers to outgrow their most famous roles. As Rob moved forward into a future defined by authorship and control, Sally remained in a space shaped by visibility and expectation. And that divergence would shape how each of them carried the legacy of All in the Family long after the cameras stopped rolling. In hindsight, Rob Reiner's departure did not weaken the show so much as it revealed how much of its emotional tension had depended on the fragile equilibrium between its characters. It also underscored a truth Sally would later articulate with clarity and grace, that some partnerships are not meant to last forever, but they leave an imprint strong enough to define an era. What followed for Rob would redefine him entirely, while for Sally, the end of that partnership marked the beginning of a far more complicated chapter, one where gratitude, limitation, and public memory collided in ways she could not fully control. When Rob Reiner reinvented himself and Sally Struthers was left watching. When Rob Reiner stepped away from All in the Family, he did not do so with a grand announcement or a public reinvention campaign, because at that moment, he did not yet know what form his next chapter would take. What he knew, with quiet certainty, was that he no longer wanted to be framed by the camera. He wanted to understand how the story itself was built, shaped, and sustained, and that instinct pulled him steadily behind the scenes. The shift did not happen overnight. For a period, Rob existed in a professional in-between, no longer the face of one of television's most provocative characters, but not yet recognized as a filmmaker with a distinct voice. He studied scripts obsessively, sat in editing rooms longer than necessary, and asked technical questions that surprised people who still thought of him as meathead. Sally Struthers later recalled that when she heard Rob was spending hours discussing structure and pacing with editors, she wasn't surprised, because even on All in the Family, he had always been thinking beyond his own performance. Rob's directorial debut, This Is Spinal Tap, in 1984, marked the moment when his public identity finally cracked open. The film's mockumentary style was not just innovative, it was risky. It asked audiences to laugh in a new way, to question the boundary between reality and performance, and to trust subtlety over spectacle. The success of the film was not immediate in traditional box office terms, but its cultural impact grew steadily, earning Rob respect as a storyteller who understood tone, timing, and restraint. For Sally Struthers, watching Rob's reinvention was both affirming and complicated. She took pride in seeing someone she had worked alongside for years redefine himself so completely, but she also felt the contrast between his expanding creative freedom and the narrowing expectations placed on her. While Rob was now celebrated for escaping his defining role, Sally found that Gloria remained the lens through which the industry continued to view her. As Rob's directing career accelerated with Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, and later When Harry Met Sally, it became clear that he possessed a rare ability to guide performances without overpowering them. Actors consistently described feeling seen and supported on his sets, a quality many traced back to his years as a performer. Sally observed from afar that Rob's greatest strength as a director was not control, but empathy. He knew when to step in and when to step back, a balance he had learned during long days on a soundstage where timing and emotional truth mattered more than volume. Meanwhile, Sally remained deeply connected to All in the Family in the public imagination. While she continued working in television, theater, and voice acting, interviews almost always circled back to Gloria, to Mike, and to the ideological battles that had defined the show. Sally never rejected that legacy, but she felt its weight, particularly as she watched Rob become known primarily for his work rather than his past. What made this period especially reflective for Sally was the absence of collaboration. Despite their shared history and mutual respect, she and Rob never worked together again in any significant professional capacity. There was no falling out, no personal rupture, just the quiet reality that their creative paths had diverged too far to naturally intersect again. Sally later described this not as abandonment, but as a truth about timing. They had met at the precise moment their energies aligned, and when that alignment shifted, the partnership concluded without bitterness. Rob's success also reframed how All in the Family itself was remembered. As his films gained recognition, critics began reassessing his television work through a different lens, acknowledging the intelligence and restraint he brought to Mike Stivic. For Sally, this reevaluation was bittersweet, because while Rob's earlier role was being elevated in hindsight, Gloria's contributions were often reduced to reaction rather than agency, despite the complexity Sally had infused into the character. As the years passed, Sally increasingly spoke about the importance of recognizing ensemble dynamics, emphasizing that All in the Family worked because every character carried weight. She was careful not to diminish Rob's achievements, but she gently pushed back against narratives that framed him as the sole intellectual engine of the show. In her view, the series' power came from collision, not dominance, and she believed that Gloria's voice, humor, and vulnerability were essential to grounding the ideological battles in lived experience. Rob, for his part, continued acknowledging Sally with respect, often crediting her performance for giving emotional dimension to Mike's arguments. In interviews, he spoke about how her reactions shaped scenes, how Gloria's expressions often carried as much meaning as dialogue. These acknowledgments mattered to Sally not because they changed public perception, but because they affirmed a shared understanding that had existed long before recognition followed. By the 1990s, Rob Reiner had fully transitioned into a director whose name stood independently of his acting past. His films spanned genres, political tones, and emotional registers, demonstrating a versatility that silenced any lingering doubts about his capabilities. Sally watched this evolution with admiration, but also with an awareness of how unevenly the industry rewards reinvention, particularly for women whose most famous roles are tied to domestic or relational identities. The distance between their careers was not a measure of value, but it was a reflection of structural realities. Rob's departure from acting was seen as a bold choice, while Sally's continued association with Gloria was often framed as limitation rather than loyalty. She did not resent Rob for this disparity, but she did recognize it, and over time, she began speaking more openly about how fame reshapes opportunity in ways that are rarely equitable. Looking back, Sally described Rob's transformation not as an escape, but as a completion of a journey that had begun long before. All in the Family. His childhood exposure to storytelling, his curiosity about structure, and his respect for collaboration all found expression behind the camera. For Sally, witnessing that fulfillment was a reminder that some artists are allowed to grow publicly, while others must negotiate growth within the confines of expectation. Their bond, forged during years of intense creative exchange, did not dissolve, but it receded into memory, preserved through mutual respect rather than continued collaboration. And as Rob's films became cultural touchstones, Sally carried the quieter task of protecting the emotional truth of a character that had helped change television, even as the industry moved on. In the end, Rob Reiner's Reinvention highlighted not only his talent, but the divergent paths available to artists emerging from the same moment. For Sally Struthers, his success was never a source of resentment, but it did sharpen her awareness of what it means to be remembered for a role versus being remembered for a body of work. After the spotlight faded, in the end, the story of Rob Reiner and Sally Struthers is not about conflict, but divergence. They emerged from the same groundbreaking moment in television, yet the industry carried them forward in very different ways. Rob was celebrated for reinvention, allowed to step behind the camera and redefine himself as a filmmaker. Sally, meanwhile, was asked to remain the emotional bridge to All in the Family, preserving its meaning even as the industry moved on. Rob's transformation was visible and rewarded. Sally's continuity was quieter, often overlooked, but no less essential. While his growth was framed as authorship and vision, her contribution was framed as legacy, a role she carried with grace rather than resistance. She did not reject her past. She protected it. Together, their paths reveal something deeper about how creative labor is remembered. Reinvention is praised, while endurance is absorbed. Visibility is mistaken for value. Yet All in the Family mattered because of balance, collision, and shared weight, not because of any single voice. When the applause faded, what remained was not rivalry, but truth. Rob Reiner's success and Sally Struthers' steadiness are two halves of the same legacy, proof that cultural change is built not only by those who move on, but also by those who stay and hold the story together. If this story made you see All in the Family differently, like the video, subscribe for more untold TV histories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which legacy do you think mattered more, reinvention or staying true to the story?